Excellent. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CSIS. Thank you all for joining us and for braving the DC paranoia about snow, or snow that's not really snow, but that causes snow days. Anyway, I'm very thrilled to have Adriana Lopez here with us today. Adriana is the sister of Leopoldo Lopez, who is an opposition leader who has been imprisoned in Venezuela since this time last year. You may have heard of his interview last week with CNN in Spanish. If not, I suggest you check it out on YouTube. I met Adriana through my friend Tom Caracas, who has known Leopoldo since they were both students at Kenyon College, and we're sort of doing this with Kenyon, so we're really appreciative of Kenyon's choosing us to do this as well. But before I turn it to Adriana, I just want to provide a little context for today's event. At this point, Venezuela is mired in social, economic, and political crisis. The crisis has been building for some time, but particularly since last year when protests spread across the country, reflecting popular dissatisfaction with the declining economy and Venezuela's increasingly repressive government. Dozens died during last year's protest, and earlier this week, we saw the first casualty of this year's protests, a 14-year-old student, a 14-year-old boy, shot by the police in an anti-government demonstration. Last week, Venezuelan intelligence agents arrested Caracas mayor and opposition leader Antonio Ledesma, alleging that he was plotting with the United States to overthrow Maduro's government. In this context, the protests have resurged. With inflation over 60%, scarcity at 80%, Maduro's approval rating is under 1/4. And Venezuelans are unhappy, and they're demanding change. The environment in the country is nothing short of toxic, and it is with all of this in mind that I'm happy that we have Adriana with us today to give us a sense of the situation. Her brother faces in prison. She'll probably provide her insights into the political dissatisfaction that's so widespread in Venezuela at the moment. Also, joining us is Jared Gensler, the international lawyer representing Leopoldo Lopez, who will participate in today's discussion as well, and I thank you for being with us today. Before we start, I want to remind you all that we're on the record this afternoon and that we're webcasting this event live to our online audience. Other media outlets have joined us as well. After Adriana speaks, and I think we'll get Jared involved as well, we'll have a Q&A. And this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of folks here. So when you do have an opportunity to ask a question, try to be as brief as you can so we can get as many as we can. With that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to you, Adriana, and we'll start from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Sure.
And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Leopoldo's youngest sister by 6 years, but we are actually very close. We're very similar in different ways, and I think of Leopoldo as a mentor, and I really admire him. One thing I tell people right off the bat is that everything that Leopoldo has done and did particularly last year and how events unfolded is absolutely coherent with the way that Leopoldo is. Leopoldo is a man of very deep convictions, and he's a man that is very clear in his positions. He does not define himself in the gray areas. And actions like what he did last February 18th demonstrate that he fights for what he believes and he doesn't waver. And I think that if anything has happened this year is just reaffirm to us as a family and to himself that that's the person that he is, and that's the right person to be. I saw him recently, 3 weeks ago, actually 3 days before he had his last requisa, when they came into his cell and took him away and put him in solitary confinement. And I had not seen him since he had been in jail. And the first thing he said, Adri, I'm doing well. I've been preparing myself for this for a long time. And what he meant by that is that he has been persecuted by the Chavez government earlier and now by Maduro's. So he's had the chance to think that this was a possibility. And he has internalized what that meant. And with that, he has used the time to really focus on spiritual growth, intellectual growth, and working on what he sees as his political, economic, social plan for the future. He is a public servant. That's the one thing that defines him. A lot of people have asked, why didn't he leave the country, go in exile, or remain in hiding? I don't think, I think of that scenario and I see a very saddened individual, somebody that would be trapped by the wrong decision. So when I saw Leopoldo, I saw the person that I know. His eyes were bright, his smile was big, his big charismatic smile that people recognize him by. And he knew that he was doing the right thing. He said it's been very hard. The hardest thing has been to be separate from his children. He has little children, 5 and 2. They were 4 and 1 when he went to jail. So that's like any human being. That's just that, the human piece is hard. I had a child. He wasn't there for that birth. My sister got married. He was not there. My father turned 70 years old. He wasn't there. So he's missing. We miss him. But we support him. We are with him, and he's alive. We are all, as a family, working on his behalf. Everybody has been doing different things, but we have really taken it at heart to make sure that people know who Leopoldo is, because by knowing who Leopoldo is, you know about Venezuela. And another important thing about Leopoldo's action is that Leopoldo is a symbolic prisoner. Leopoldo was speaking on behalf of millions of people in Venezuela that don't have a voice. Leopoldo has the privilege of having a platform that people listen to. And by caring about Leopoldo, you care about other political prisoners. And that's really one of the missions that we have as a family, is to ensure that that voice is heard.
Can you you've talked a lot about sort of the personal dimension, right? It's your brother, right? I mean, people talk about the political side, and obviously there's a huge context here, and what people are suffering and people are fighting in Venezuela are very, sensitive, passionate things. Can you talk a little bit about your brother's condition? How have they treated him? You talked about his psychological condition a little bit. How is his health in general?
I saw Leopoldo well. He's very thin, but he's very strong. Now, fortunately, he has not been tortured like other people in Venezuela have, that we don't know who or how or what has happened. We know that people are being tortured. Leopoldo's been tortured in a different way. He is getting a lot of psychological torture, so to speak, when they punish him without reasons. His children show up to see him, and they say, you can't come in, he's punished. Why? Well, he's just punished. So, 2 weeks go by, and he can't see his family. The first 6 months of his imprisonment, he was not able to leave his cell. They took him out in the mornings at 6 in the morning for 1 hour, and that's all the daylight he got. And he had no interactions with any of the inmates or any other people other than his direct family. They have done things, you might have read about this, where they punished him by throwing excrement and urine into his cell and cutting the water and electricity so that he couldn't clean up. So those are the type of tortures that they do to him. When I went to visit him, I was not allowed to see him 3 times. It was just in the last bit that I was able to see him. Just little things that they do because they knew that he really wanted to see me. So that was upsetting. But they have really punished him a lot. Right now he's in solitary confinement again in a 2x2 cell. And it is detrimental to his health because he cannot see the daylight for days in a row.
And a lot of folks that cover Venezuela are very familiar with the story, but there's a lot of people that don't know very much about him, don't know why he's in jail, and there's a lot of folks who also wonder, what does the government fear about Leopoldo? I mean, why is he such a threat?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. I think the government fears a person that has no fear. Leopoldo is absolutely fearless, and if anybody doubts that, then they haven't been paying attention. And I think it comes back to what I said. He has a very deep conviction of what is right, and by having such clarity, he is not afraid to confront the government and call out what's wrong. So why is he in prison? Is because he was, in his discourse and his actions, calling the government out on the things that are bad with the system. From an economic and a social standpoint, and the details are known to everybody, he was supporting student protests on February 12th, and he was calling for nonviolent, peaceful protests. And when it was over, he told people to peacefully leave the stage, so to speak. And then, they set him up, and they're trying him for inciting violence through his discourse. That's what supposedly he's being tried for.
Mm-hmm. And things have gotten pretty rough in Venezuela, and things are pretty violent. Do you think that Leopoldo faces bigger risks when he's out of jail? I mean, how do you see that?
It's interesting to if we go back to the week when Leopoldo was in hiding. Leopoldo, this is an interesting detail. So the protest that I was talking about on February 12th, he leaves the place of the protest at around 2 in the afternoon. The deaths happened between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. And at 9 p.m., the government had issued a warrant for his arrest, blaming him for these deaths. There was definitely not enough time to pull all the evidence that would point to Leopoldo as the actor, intellectual material of this event. So this was obviously a frame. So he goes into hiding after a press conference, and in those days, there was a lot of talk, what to do, what the options were. In one of those nights, the government visited my family. It was very late at night. My sister-in-law and the children were staying with my parents. They knock on the door. My father says, "Who is it?" And a voice says, "We're looking for Leopoldo Lopez." And my father says, "Well, I'm here." And he opens the door and sees men in masks with long arms, immediately closes the door. And they say, "No, we are looking for Leopoldo Lopez." And he says, "No, I'm here." "No, we're looking for the other Leopoldo Lopez." And my father says, "Okay, well, wait." And he makes sure that the other, mind you, this is a man who's about to be 70 years old. My mother is 68, my sister-in-law, and 2 children. That's it. There's nobody else at home. So he says, just go in the living room, and he lets the people in. They did not have a warrant for search, a search warrant. My father asked them to please take the masks off because it was extremely scary. And there was a moment when the president of the National Assembly met with my family, and one of the things that he was trying to tell my parents was that the government feared that Leopoldo was going to be assassinated, that there was a plot for his murder, and that they wanted to protect Leopoldo, and that for that reason they really encouraged him to leave the country or do not come out publicly. Now, who was plotting that? What evidence they had for that is unknown. And I'm just telling you this story as an inkling to tell you that anything can happen to Leopoldo when he steps out. Anybody can be plotting an assassination. Now, again, Leopoldo is fearless, and I know that the day that Leopoldo comes out, he's going to go from one end of the country to the other, and he's going to walk, and millions of people are going to go behind him, and that's going to be his protection.
I want to bring you in the conversation a little bit. What are your reactions to this? And you've seen lots of similar situations to these. You've worked on a lot of cases that are similar to this. What do you think about all this?
So I'm an international human rights lawyer. My specialty is freeing prisoners of conscience around the world. And Leopoldo Lopez is a classic prisoner of conscience. And his case has become world-renowned because of how outrageous it is what the government is doing to him. He's been charged with 4 crimes based on what happened on the events of the February 12th, even though he wasn't actually physically present when security officials opened fire on a crowd and killed 3 people. He's been charged with incitement to commit violence, conspiracy to commit violence, arson, and property damage. And literally, actually, in the last 24 hours, I have some breaking news to announce, which is that the government's case has officially now fallen apart. The claim in the indictment, amazingly, was that even though they recognize that he's advocated nonviolence, even though he's called for change within the framework of the Constitution, even though he wants everything to be peaceful, the claim was that, and even though he wasn't physically present at the events when the people were killed, and the security, it was security officials of the government that opened fire, not protesters opening fire, that he used subliminal messages to incite people to violence. This was the claim in the indictment. And they had a section of the indictment that goes on for several pages explaining how Leopoldo has a style of rhetoric that makes people very angry at the government, and that they don't realize it, but it makes them so angry that they decide to go commit violence. Literally, yesterday, the trial has been ongoing at a pretty slow pace. There was a 12-hour sitting of the trial that went till about 2 in the morning, actually this morning. And the primary witness for that 12 hours was this this expert, who's a university professor, expert in linguistics, and was the witness that was in the indictment. And although she defended her case on the front end when being questioned by prosecutors, under cross-examination, she actually acknowledged to the court that Leopoldo was not responsible for the violence that took place with the security officials opening fire, that the grievances that he's expressing are legitimate grievances that reasonable people might have with the government. She wasn't taking a position as to whether they were right or wrong, but she said these are grievances that a lot of Venezuelans feel. And although we already knew that he didn't have superhero powers to inspire people to subliminal acts, that there was no evidence that he was capable of inspiring people to violence through subliminal messages. So the government doesn't need any evidence, obviously, to convict him of any crime. The due process in this case has been equally outrageous and egregious. I'll just give you a couple quick examples, and then we can have more of a discussion. But a couple of quick examples. You have, in his case, 100 witnesses approved for the prosecution. The defense proposed 60 witnesses and a whole bunch of videos. The videos included him speaking to a crowd of hundreds of thousands and nobody committing any acts of violence, people, screaming, cheering, but doing everything nonviolently. They denied 58 of the 60 witnesses and all of the videos with no explanation. So 100 witnesses on one side, 2 on the other side. The judge in the case is neither independent nor impartial. That's obviously well known with Venezuela. It isn't often, as a human rights lawyer, that I actually get can actually prove that the judiciary is not independent and impartial. In this case, we actually have proof of this fact. There was an initial judge assigned to the case who confirmed the terms of the indictment, and she had a friend in Miami who texted her afterwards, because I guess the friend believed her to be more pro-democratic, and said, "How could you do that?" in a text message to the friend, to the judge. And the judge responded, "I had no choice or I would lose my job." And that probably now former friend went to the media with that text message. The media proved that it was the judge's phone, and shockingly, the judge is now no longer on the case, and in fact, she's now in exile. And then I would just say lastly that obviously a flagrant violation of the presumption of innocence over and over and over again. President Maduro attacking Leopoldo, calling him the murderer of Ramo Verde prison. He hasn't been charged with murder, let alone convicted of it. So how is he the murderer of Ramo Verde? Maduro saying publicly that he's guilty and he will pay for his sins. All of these are, of course, a clear violation of the presumption of innocence. But this is a classic prisoner of conscience case. The charges are outrageous. The lack of due process is outrageous. And what's happening to Leopoldo, if it can happen to such a high-profile person, imagine what it's like for the average person on the street who, a policeman gets angry for whatever reason and decides to do something to them. I mean, they have no hope or a prayer if they can do this to someone like Leopoldo.
So who does this compare to? I mean, you've worked with a lot of situations like this. Does anyone in particular come to mind?
Look, I mean, I spent 5 years representing Aung San Suu Kyi of Burma while she was under house arrest. He and she are very similar in a whole host of ways. I currently represent also Liu Xiaobo of China, the 2010 Nobel Peace Laureate. I began representing him 6 months before he won the prize. He was imprisoned for his writings, calling for change in China and calling actually for a transformation of the one-party system into a multi-party democracy. Liu Xiaobo remains in prison. And I mention those names because, frankly, there is very little difference, actually, between Leopoldo and the two of them. The other two may be slightly better known. I think Leopoldo is well on the way to becoming as well known as the two of them. And it's because of what he stands for. And I think if you read his speeches and you see how extraordinarily impressive he is, you see how fearless he is and the courage with which he's faced down the Maduro government, there are so few people in the world today that are inspirational figures. I mean, we are looking around for inspiring politicians in the United States. I know I'm looking a lot for people like that. You don't see a lot. But someone like him who stands for freedom, democracy, and human rights, his motto is all rights for all people. And he's talked about how he won't be the first political prisoner released. In fact, he will refuse to go unless all of them are released at the same time. And despite what he's face down with his own 2 children. His daughter, I mean, it's just such a terrible story, heartbreaking story. His daughter Manuela asked him in prison in front of Leopoldo in front of Lily and his wife, you know, Daddy, are you going to die here in prison? And I think that that kind of gives you a sense of what he is going through personally and how heart-wrenching it must be for what he's going through. But people in this circumstance, in my experience, always come out of prison 100 times stronger and 100 times more powerful. And the irony is that just merely by sitting in prison as he is and having the world come and rally support on his behalf and standing up to Maduro the way he is inspiring tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. And he is a lot more powerful today than when Maduro first locked him up 1 year ago.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the news that you shared with us? What would be the next steps if this witness has sort of reversed their testimony? What would be the next steps from a legal perspective?
If only the law mattered in Venezuela. I can give you my my political assessment,
Okay.
which is going to be more valuable than my legal assessment. Obviously, I work closely with our Venezuelan lawyers, but the law doesn't matter in Venezuela. So far, they've been dragging out this trial rather slowly. So a little bit of history will be helpful. In 2008, Leopoldo had served his 2 4-year terms as the mayor of Chacao, the municipality in Caracas, the central business district. And he was going to run for mayor of Grand Caracas, and he was up by 20, 30 points in the polls. He was viewed as being up by 5 or 10 points against Chavez in a hypothetical presidential matchup. So the government manufactured some bogus charges against him, and ultimately he was disqualified from running for political office for 6 years. The Inter-American Court later said that that was in violation of the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights. The government ignored it. So in any event, the government didn't think they had to worry about Leopoldo all that much until this past February, and then these public protests come about, and then you know, he's detained. His deprivation of political rights expired this past December, and in fact, unless he's convicted, he can run for parliament next fall, even from his prison cell. And unfortunately, I think the government needs to convict him to make him disqualified in order to be able to stand for the parliament. It's not clear yet what they're going to do. They've been slow rolling the trial at this point. I mean, with 100 witnesses on one side, and they were meeting about once a week for 6 or 8 hours at a time. You can imagine how long it might take. And so far, they don't appear to be in any rush to get to a final outcome. But on the other hand, you know, judges in Venezuela have absolute discretion, and tomorrow the judge could say, I've heard enough. We don't need any more witnesses. We're done. I'm going to issue a judgment. So the short answer is I have no idea what's going to happen. Clearly, this is damaging to the government, but the government obviously so far doesn't care all that much about how they're being viewed. If they charge him with crimes of using subliminal messages to incite people to violence, I don't know who they think believes that. I can't even imagine that Maduro himself believes that that's actually possible. But in any event, you know, we're going to have to see how that plays out ultimately. I think what we're seeing swirling around in the background, as you alluded to in your very strong opening, is a rapid downward spiral of the economic and political system in Venezuela, and Maduro being under immense pressure. You know, Venezuela owes $45 billion to China. He recently went on a tour around the world to China, to other lenders to try to drum up more money and support. The price of oil has dropped, you know, 2/3 in the last year alone, which has been devastating for. Despite having the largest oil reserves in the world, it's been devastating for the Venezuelan economy. And you see stories every day about how extraordinarily the bolivar has been devalued. So the question for Maduro is how long can he hold on under these circumstances? And you know, I will say that as a human rights lawyer who's gone up against many authoritarian governments, that you know, Maduro has been quite helpful to our cause by the way that he's reacted in a whole host of ways to Leopoldo's imprisonment and to repressing human rights in Venezuela. And we'll continue to rely on his assistance to help get Leopoldo out of prison because he's not doing himself any favors here. And the question is, will he be prepared to walk back from this, or is he going to go down with the ship? I mean, I think that you know, at the end of the day, if I were somebody advising Maduro, I tell him that the dumbest thing that you did is lock Leopoldo Lopez up, and the smartest thing that you can do is let him and all the other political prisoners out of jail. And yes, of course, Leopoldo will march and travel the country, but at the end of the day, Maduro has some very large problems other than Leopoldo Lopez, and he's not addressing them. And I think that that's ultimately why Leopoldo is so much more powerful today than he has been in the past, because the fundamental problems of insecurity, one person gunned down every 20 minutes, 25,000 people last year, you know, all the economic statistics you were talking about, the people of Venezuela are deeply unhappy, and it's not that Leopoldo Lopez is going to make them happy. It's that Leopoldo wants to directly address the fundamental challenges facing the country, and Maduro does not. And by definition, that's going to make Leopoldo very, very popular.
Okay. Yep.
And he's only become more popular since he was detained.
So the last time you spoke with your brother was when?
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago. And the conditions he's in right now, describe him a little bit. And how long will he be in these conditions? Because what we know is that basically he's being punished right now for having given the interview that he did, and the interview that's the CNN interview that I alluded to in the opening. He's in worse conditions than the ones that he was in the outset. How long is he going to be in those
My understanding is that he's not going back to his original cell. My
Okay.
understanding is that that cell was, they went in and they spent 7 hours destroying all of his personal belongings, which personal belongings in a prison cell amount to books, writings, photographs, and drawings or paintings. I mean, which is, it's very sad. Apparently the colonel himself was ripping apart photos of his family in front of Leopoldo, just those type of episodes. I think my understanding, nobody from my family has seen Leopoldo in this new cell, only his lawyer, Juan Carlos Gutierrez, and it's a small cell, and Daniel Ceballos was also taken away from his cell and put in a smaller cell as well. I believe that the punishment, solitary confinement punishment, is going to be lifted this weekend.
Okay.
They have returned some of his books to him, but I think that he's permanently moved to this smaller cell.
Okay. Well, I want to sort of take an opportunity and get questions from folks in the audience. So this is the time if you'd like to ask a question. Why don't we start up here in the front with the mic, and then we'll move back.
Good afternoon. My name is Philip French. I'm a retired State Department. I'm also Executive Director of the American Committees on Foreign Relations. Thank you for being with us. All sorts of questions pop up, when Carl mentions all these statistics. One has to wonder, I don't wonder, that Maduro's numbers are down to 25%. I wonder, how are they as high as 25% given the situation? And so my question is, there's supposedly a rift between the Capriles Redonci camp and the Lopez Corina Machado camp. And is that part of the reason why, despite things being so bad, there doesn't seem to be a groundswell of support for the opposition, and there seems to be a certain sense of resignation to what's happening in Venezuela? Thank you.
Politics is a very complicated field, and it's not my field of expertise, it's my brother's. It's the opposition in Venezuela has gone through some very dramatic changes over the last year, as it is obvious with everything that has happened. I do believe that there are people that are more convinced, and actually the statistics say it's the highest number, it's 80% of the people believe that things need to change. Now, whether they are going for one candidate or another, or one political party or another, it's unclear. I think that the people that are in certain positions are trying as hard as they can to keep those posts so that they can confront the government. But the government arbitrarily is taking mayors out of their positions. This morning, the alcaldesa de Apure from Voluntad Popular was taken arbitrarily out of her post. Antonio Ledesma, the mayor of Caracas, was taken out of his post arbitrarily. And it is very hard for the people to support the whichever opposition is in power right now, because the government is really circling and asphyxiating what little positions they have. I do believe deeply that things are changing in such a way that there will be a consolidation and a coherent plan that will come out. But I do think that the problems right now are beyond politics, because it's an insecurity issue, it's an economic issue. Those things are what's really plaguing the country right now, and people want answers they want changes for that, not so much a political rally. It's not what they're looking for.
I think we're going to go over here, and then we'll come back over here. We can get a microphone, please.
Andy Judah, I'm a journalist from Argentina. The last question to the State Department about Venezuela, I did it personally 3 days ago. related to the situation of Venezuela, what's going on, the point of view from the State Department. I was in the briefing 3 days ago, and I was asking them what are their views, what they think is going on, and if they're only going to do statements. And when I finished the briefing, one of the journalists told me, I don't know if the US really is doing much more in Venezuela than only sending statements. Maybe they don't care as much as before. So my point of view is, what do you expect from the US? Are you feeling that the Obama administration is really engaged in the situation of Venezuela, or this is another case and they are waiting for a change, or maybe here for another government to take this on? What do you think? What's your real sensation of what is going on from Washington to Venezuela?
So early on, Washington has shown support by voicing their concern. Specifically about Leopoldo, Obama mentioned Leopoldo in a speech. I do think, however, that it's not as important what the U.S. thinks if the U.S. is standing alone. I think it's important for the Americas to step up, and I'm actually most disappointed on the Latin American countries. I believe that if you're going to compare apples to apples, the United States has actually been more supportive of the Venezuelan people and the crisis that they're facing than our brother countries in South America and in Central America.
And let me mention, I mean, yes, the United States is important, and obviously we're here in Washington, but support for Leopoldo and the Venezuelan human rights cause has been global, and I've been honored to travel with Lilian Tintori around the world. We met the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who issued a very strong and public statement. We most recently met Jose Miguel Insulza here in Washington, the President of the European Parliament. I mean, we have had extraordinary support all around the world advocating for freedom, democracy, and human rights in Venezuela. Look, I think what Leopoldo has said, and of course, I'm focused on this as a human rights matter, not as a political matter, but what Leopoldo said is that it's up to each country in the world to decide how they want to react and respond to Venezuela. And so I'm not going to get out in front of him on that. What I will say is, you know, I was in the meeting with Lilian Tintori and the other Venezuelans with Vice President Biden, sitting across the table from him for half an hour, and there is no question in my mind that he knows exactly what is going on in Venezuela, that he cares deeply about what's happening to Leopoldo Lopez and other political prisoners. And he spoke in a range of ways in that context about what the United States has been doing and intends to do. And so I would say that, yes, it's important that the United States continue to speak out and to take action. Obviously, you know, the administration's indicated that it will implement the Venezuela bill that was adopted this past December. There have already been a range of travel bans put in place on some 20-plus Venezuelan officials. But at the end of the day, I couldn't agree more with Adriana. I mean, where is Latin America, right? I mean, we had President Santos of Colombia standing alone, and to his immense credit, especially given the intersection of interest between Colombia and Venezuela, he spoke out for the release of political prisoners in the country. But the rest of Latin America has been absent. And to me, that's surprising because of how important Venezuela is to the region. And if Venezuela doesn't turn the ship around and start to do things much differently, the impact, if it implodes economically in the entire region, and the security impact in the region would be absolutely devastating. And so, to my mind, I very much hope that countries like Brazil and Argentina and Chile and Mexico, stand up, particularly with the forthcoming Summit of the Americas, and start to take action. I guess the last thing I have to note, which is very important, is the changing U.S. relationship with Cuba, and that Maduro now is very much, obviously, it's not like overnight the situation with Cuba has changed completely. There are major human rights challenges in Cuba. I say that as a human rights lawyer. But the U.S. relationship with Cuba is not the same as it was for the last 60 years. And my hope is that that changing dynamic will also give the United States more ability to engage with Latin America on Venezuela as well. And, I'm confident that the United States will be bringing up Venezuela, Cuba at the Summit of the Americas. And really, though, I would ask, where is Latin America? At the end of the day, if the neighbors don't care, then it's going to be very, very hard to put serious pressure on Maduro.
Sure. We get the question up here.
Hi, my name is Andrea. I am from Argentina too, and my question was very related to the one that he did. I would like to know if you can explain a bit better was the support that you're receiving from the Latin American governments, and not only the governments, also the civil societies of organizations, because you know that in Argentina we have a lot of civil societies organizations that are working very hard in the human rights issues, and I would like to know if you're receiving any support or not, and how do you feel about that?
So
And just to frame it a little bit, because I think it's important, because you mentioned a really important point, both of you, support from Latin America. So you've had a history in countries in Latin America of authoritarian governments and violations of human rights from the right. And you also have an experience now that I guess would be defined being more from the left of authoritarianism. And you still don't have, and I think for a long time you had voices protesting against authoritarianism from the right, but here you have authoritarianism from the left and people seem to be silent. And that's something that I think is a contradiction with regards to just challenges in general that the region has faced. And I join in what you're saying. I think that it's a bit strange, to say it nicely. And I want to pursue this a little bit more with the mechanisms that you would have within the OAS to deal with human rights violations, the international criminal, all the relevant branches of multilateral government. Is there any way of dealing with this within that framework, not just with what you're doing in Venezuela?
Sure.
And then I'll let you answer the question.
So I mean, let me say two things. One is I didn't mean at all to exclude Dilma Rousseff and Brazil,
Right.
who, of course, is probably the most important person of all in terms of relating on these issues, and is obviously from the political left, and previously was in prison herself, and has been unwilling to engage with Maduro on these issues. Look, I mean, I think the OAS is complicated, we all know. I think the Summit of the Americas will be a very interesting time. I think that the fact that the Secretary General of the OAS has been willing now to be outspoken about Venezuela, whereas in the past he has not, demonstrates, I think, a change in some attitudes, which I think is very, very valuable. You know, there's been motions recently to put Venezuela on the table within the OAS context and to have, you know, direct discussions there. I suspect when all the presidents sit down together in the room in the Summit of the Americas, we're going to see direct, you know, questions being asked on what's happening in Venezuela. So there are definitely mechanisms within the OAS. That said, we also know the OAS is deeply divided, and when Maria Corina Machado was looking to speak to the OAS, you know, you had a majority voting to keep the room closed and then denying her the ability to speak. And I think at the end of the day, that speaks volumes about where Latin America is. But it's interesting, we've had a lot of discussions, we've traveled the world, we've met privately with a lot of Latin American diplomats, and they speak about non-interference. And, you know, when you're talking to governments that have come from authoritarian contexts, we have directly raised with them, well, that's okay, that's interesting that you're talking about non-interference, and I understand that given the history of Latin America and interference, shall we say, from outside the region, you are very sensitive to that, but is that what you were calling for when you were living under authoritarian government? Did you want non-interference? Did you want the world to be silent? Did you not want people to speak up for human rights and democracy? And by the way, it turns out, of course, as we all know, that Venezuela sheltered many, many people who were fleeing Pinochet in Chile or, you know, various Latin American dictatorships. Where are you supporting the people of Venezuela, not the government, but the people of Venezuela who were there when you were living under a dictatorship yourself? And unfortunately, we haven't gotten any good answers to those questions, except that, you know, we hear what you're saying, and thank you for sharing. And, you know, it's, I think that this hopefully will be the drumbeat in the run-up to the Summit of the Americas, which is the OAS going to stand silent, or is it going to be counted in this situation? Because again, to me, it isn't just about Leopoldo and the political prisoners and human rights, although to me, that's a central issue. But it's also about what is the effect of Venezuela's collapse going to have on the region, and why aren't countries in Latin America more worried about that? And so that, to me, is a critical question.
So to your points, I have 2 points. One is, and to answer you directly, we have not received, Venezuela has not really received support from sitting governors, but there has been an outpour of support for Leopoldo specifically, as well as for the human rights violations in Venezuela from numerous organizations all over the continent. I don't know, the name escapes me, but there's a Commission of Human Rights, or there's a congregation of human rights groups, and every one of those organizations has pronounced itself in support of Venezuela, asking for Leopoldo's liberation. Ex-presidents have shown support for Leopoldo and for political prisoners. In fact, some of them tried to visit and were not allowed to visit Leopoldo. I think the issue is, you were asking about the Obama administration, so we're talking about sitting governments and what are those sitting politicians doing or not doing. The people that have less at stake, so to speak, because they're not sitting on the top of the pinnacle, have been very outspoken. The other point about right or left, if you care to know, we've had support from Internacional Socialista, which is left, for Leopoldo and for Voluntad Popular and for political prisoners in Venezuela. We've had support from Piñera, who is from the right in Chile. So I don't think that this is a right or left issue. When you're talking about human rights violations, it cannot be divided in a left or a right. And in Venezuela right now, the problem is a deep violation of human rights.
Okay. Let me go all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Pedro Ureli. I'm a friend of Leopoldo's and the family. One of the things that the family has done with the help of Jared is raise the cost for the government of having Leopoldo in jail. Obviously, the news about this case has gone, way up in the last months. So people are beginning to know him like other famous political prisoners. The problem, and what I wanted to ask Jared from your perspective and your experience is, as the cost of keeping him goes up, the cost of releasing him also goes up. Leopoldo has become the symbol of a lot in Venezuela. While there are people who might not have agreed with him at the beginning, I think it would be a little bit like Adriana said, if he's released. The government knows that. So if the government was fearful of him in 2004, and in 2005, and in 2006, and onwards, they've actually built a very powerful politician who, for any of us who listened to him in CNN, he was 10 times better on CNN than a year ago. And he was good a year ago. What happens, Jared? How do we get a government who has obviously made a huge mistake, who's now realizing that its worst enemy has become a massively powerful individual? How do you get an out for a government so that we don't have to wait for the government to go away as a means of getting Leopoldo out? Is there a mechanism by which somehow this can be negotiated? Because I think this is what happens with this very powerful prisoners of conscience, that they become almost too difficult to release.
Yeah. Well, and it's a great question, Pedro. I've spent 15 years of my life pondering that over and over and over again on every case that I work on. What I would say is this, that there are different people that will play different roles here. Our role on behalf of Leopoldo and the family is to use his story to tell the story of Venezuela around the world, and for the family to advocate for his freedom out of their political prisoners and for justice and accountability for perpetrators. There will be others who will be looking for easy ways out for Venezuela or face-saving ways out, and frankly, that isn't our role. At the end of the day, Maduro would never let Leopoldo out, whether he was as well known as he is now or whether he wasn't. When they put him in prison, he was already a big threat, and that's why they locked him up. And so my experience has been that the only thing that dictators understand is fear, right? That is the only emotion that drives them, is fear. And Maduro will not let him out because he wants to. He will never let him out because he wants to. He will let him out because he has to. And it will be because he is looking at two bad choices, and the least worst alternative is letting Leopoldo out. And so our role, and what we will continue to do, and we are going to fight aggressively and strongly and repeatedly and relentlessly, is to raise the cost of Maduro in every forum that we travel around the world, to keep the pressure on Maduro, to tell Leopoldo's story, and to leave it to the world to put pressure on the government of Venezuela. Others will figure out how there's a graceful exit for Maduro. Obviously, we're talking to lots of people, including people who talk to the government of Venezuela. But I agree with you, it is always a trade-off between the rising costs and the rising benefits. And you're right, he will be released and he'll be dramatically more powerful. At the end of the day, the question for Maduro, I think, is going to become, is he going to maintain his grip on power because everything is going to spin out of control? Or if he releases Leopoldo, will he have a lifeline thrown to him by a couple of governments that will enable him to remain in power? And if it's a choice between remaining in power versus a Ceausescu outcome, or otherwise, I'm thinking Maduro's pretty smart, and he's going to want to live, and he's going to remain in charge. but he'll never let him out because he wants to. It's only because he has no choice. And so our job is to make it as painful and as difficult and as frustrating and as infuriating as we can. And that is exactly what we are doing, and that is what we're going to keep doing until he makes the right decision.
Okay. There's another, I think you had a question, sir? Yeah, with the glasses. Let me get a microphone quickly. Okay.
Yes, I'm Bert Gorowski. I just wondered, also a good friend of your father, Leopoldo, why is the Leopoldo's case and whole Venezuela's case not really placed in the context of the reality of a government receiving 97% of all the export income of the country? It's sort of such a concentration of power that anything can happen in any type of country like that. And sometimes when I speak with some of the people in the OES and all that, what I hear, government people, is a sort of envy over the type of power that the governments in Venezuela have, and they don't. So why is it not really never displaced in the context of just an excessive power, government power, no matter what in a country? Imagine this country, if 97% of all the export revenues of the US went into the government. It's just, mind-boggling to think of it. So I think that we have to also place Leopoldo in that context, what is happening to him and what is happening to others. This is a just too powerful government, and with such power, anything can happen.
Well, I mean, it is a daunting situation, and if we let the picture that you painted, if we let that lead us or lead Leopoldo, then we would give up. And I think that thankfully in history there are people like Leopoldo and other people in Venezuela that are fighting because they do believe that although they are the most powerful, that there is a David to fight Goliath. I mean, that's all I can say. I wonder why Leopoldo took up this fight, and it's because he believes that he can make a change, because if nobody stands up to the government, then they will stay in power if nobody cares. It's
worth noting, one of the things that I thought has been found interesting is, look, I do human rights, I don't do politics, but obviously I read things before I take up a case about who my potential client might be. And when I was reading about Leopoldo before I got involved in the case, I saw that kind of the Chavistas and the government portrayed him as being of the political right and of him being, part of elite aristocracy of Venezuela. And I think that the one thing that I've learned is, getting to know him, getting to know his family over the last 7 or 8 months, is, that is about as far off an assessment as one can come up with. And I think that, when I read his speeches and what he stood for, the speech he gave on February 12th, when I've seen his platforms and what he argues for, he's a human rights partisan. He's not a political partisan. He's called for change to the government of Venezuela through the Constitution and the means provided in the Constitution, non-violently and in accordance with the rule of law. He's called for human rights for all people. He's called for reforming the economic system of Venezuela so that the poor have a fighting shot at it. And at the end of the day, these are all just political labels that get thrown around. But what he stands for and what he's advocating for, to me as a human rights lawyer, is purely straight down the middle, freedom, democracy, and human rights. And so I think that, there are obviously a whole lot, much broader set of problems going on in Venezuela right now that are more than just human rights. But I think that on his behalf, the family has decided to focus on human rights because, frankly, unless you have fundamental human rights assured for all people in a country, free speech, freedom of association, freedom to vote for your political leaders, right? The rule of law. Without any of those basic fundamental human rights, the ability to actually address the problems of a country of the size of the problems of Venezuela are next to impossible, really, because you can't ever hold the government to account for the bad decisions it's making, and governments like that are authoritarian are corrupt, inefficient, and unaccountable. And so I think that Leopoldo's arguments that he puts forward, which are focused on human rights first, is actually probably the only way that Venezuela has a fighting chance to turn the ship around economically and politically in this country.
I think there were two other questions, so we're gonna take those two questions, and I think we're gonna wrap up. So the gentleman over there, and then the lady up here.
Actually, taking in Mr. Lopez is definitely a violation of freedom of speech. But taking in Mr. Lezama at the same time, Ledesma a little later, makes this more of a case of trying to get rid of the opposition. The question is, what is the relation? The second question is, what situation, what act could have triggered this situation? And the last question is, how much of an influence has the Cuban Secret Service or the security apparatus in present Venezuela?
So
why now is, I guess, part of the question. Yeah.
So Ledesma, along with Maria Corina Machado, have accompanied and supported Leopoldo's plight. So the three of them were of the opposition, very outspoken in their asks of the government for change. Leopoldo went first. I believe because they fear Leopoldo the most. They went after Ledesma. I don't understand why they went after Ledesma and not others all at once. If there was a conspiracy, you would assume there would be more than one person. They just took one instead of taking the whole posse and get rid of that. It's the decisions that this government makes are puzzling. And you know, if it was a smart government, it wouldn't be making these decisions. I think everybody's very puzzled as to why they literally kidnapped the mayor of Caracas, the sitting mayor of Caracas, from his office with no evidence. I can only presume that there are more coming. It's just a matter of time. They are scared of the opposition. This is a desperate government, and they're doing desperate things. Cuba has been in Venezuela for a long time, and so that's a conversation for another day.
Another session, right up here.
Hi, Heather Scott from Market News International. Adriana, I wanted to ask you what it is, further continuing what you were just saying a little moment ago, what is it that you would like to see happen that is most likely to trigger some kind of change? Is it an outpouring from human rights organizations, Latin American governments? Would the OAS action help? It doesn't seem that Maduro is sympathetic to any sort of outside pressure. So what do you think needs to happen that would force his hand and force him to at least sit down at the negotiating table to change these policies?
Well, the Venezuelan government preceding Maduro, the Venezuelan Chavez's government, has a history of not responding to any type of international sanctions that have been bestowed upon them. In Leopoldo's case, specifically in the Human Rights Commission in Costa Rica, in the case of Judge Afuni, when she actually ruled because of the United Nations decision on arbitrary detention. In Leopoldo's case, when they ruled that Leopoldo's detention was arbitrary, they have not freed him. It is a government that does not care about international organizations, although it is in our constitution that international decisions supersede national rulings. So they are in blatant, what I'm looking for? Disregard of the Constitution of Venezuela and all the international treaties that we are in. So what can we hope? We can hope for pressure. Now, realistically, what's going to turn the government around? I think the only thing is that the world comes to a consensus that stops buying oil from Venezuela. You have to cut the cash. It's the only thing, because any type of legal pressure that has been put upon the government, they seem to disregard it. Now, do we need to keep the pressure on? Absolutely. The more eyes and awareness that there is about the Venezuelan political prisoners, including Leopoldo, the safer they can be. Leopoldo, they have threatened to move Leopoldo twice already to some very dangerous prisons in Venezuela, and they have not. And I believe that in large part they haven't done that because there has been so much international awareness about every movement about Leopoldo. So what I ask of the international community is to maintain the pressure and maintain the awareness on Venezuela, because if we let loose, then they're going to get away with murder. Well, those are individual sanctions, and that's something that each government decides what to do. But I do think that there need to be more than just pronouncements. There need to be some specific actions that hurt individuals in power.
I will say, though, that on the one hand, they don't appear to be changing their behavior based on the public outcry, but they also are lashing out in ways that are irrational and entertaining in a whole host of ways by the claims that they make. And that actually helps us a lot. I mean, I've gone up against authoritarian governments that are as nasty as they get. Take a China, for example, right? They don't respond publicly at all anymore these days because they know that even the United States, the UK, and France are going to be soft pedaling on human rights because we have lots of intertwining interests, right? And the fact that Maduro keeps publicly responding to all of these attacks that are on him demonstrates profound weakness, right? Profound weakness, because if he was strong and if he was confident, he could just do what he wanted and not care what anybody had to say. But he has his narrative he has to put out to the Chavistas, and he has to be viewed as internationally defending the honor of Venezuela. And to me, that demonstrates that there is an opportunity here to move a Venezuela, which frankly is dramatically harder to move a China. And so I do think that that provides a moment of hope to think that, you know, rather than saying, okay, let's step back and let's kind of regroup, right? What we're doing is working. Right? And we need to take it to the next level, and we need to keep the pressure on.
Last question, right here. You just get the microphone here. Sorry, here's the microphone. Yep.
Thank you. Just to follow up on your comment about oil and buying oil. So my understanding is the United States is actually the only country that pays market price. Obviously, the market price is down right now. So in your view, should the U.S. play the oil card? Should the U.S. stop
I'm not to importing? Say that I don't have enough information to say that, but this is just an hypothetical. This is a hypothetical answer to a government that does not respond to many pressures that come internationally. I think that in the end, cutting oil from Venezuela would end up really hurting Venezuelans because it is where we get the money to keep the country going. That's not the answer. The answer is real change, real hard economic decisions need to be made to turn the country around and let an oil-producing country do what it does, which is effectively produce oil and other things to maintain a healthy economy.
So having said that, I want to thank Kenyon College for helping make this happen. Jared, thank you so much. And in particular, I just want to thank you, Adriana, for coming, sharing this. It has to be difficult to have your brother in that situation, but you're doing the right thing by going out there and building awareness of his case and of what's happening in Venezuela. So if you could all join me in a round of applause, thank you so much.
Gracias.
Excellent. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to CSIS. Thank you all for joining us and for braving the DC paranoia about snow. Or snow that's not really snow, but that causes snow days. Anyway, I'm very thrilled to have Adriana Lopez here with us today. Adriana is the sister of Leopoldo Lopez, who is an opposition leader who has been imprisoned in Venezuela since this time last year. You may have heard of his interview last week with CNN in Spanish. If not, I suggest you check it out on YouTube. I met Adriana through my friend Tom Caracas, who has known Leopoldo since they were both students at Kenyon College, and we're sort of doing this with Kenyon, so we're really appreciative of Kenyon's choosing us to do this as well. But before I turn it to Adriana, I just want to provide a little context for today's event. At this point, Venezuela is mired in social, economic, and political crisis. The crisis has been building for some time, but particularly since last year when protests spread across the country, reflecting popular dissatisfaction with the declining economy and Venezuela's increasingly repressive government. Dozens died during last year's protests, and earlier this week, we saw the first casualty of this year's protests, a 14-year-old student, a 14-year-old boy, shot by the police in an anti-government demonstration. Last week, Venezuelan intelligence agents arrested Caracas mayor and opposition leader Antonio Ledesma, alleging that he was plotting with the United States to overthrow Maduro's government. In this context, the protests have resurged. With inflation over 60%, Scarcity at 80%. Maduro's approval rating is under 1/4. And Venezuelans are unhappy, and they're demanding change. The environment in the country is nothing short of toxic. And it is with all of this in mind that I'm happy that we have Adriana with us today to give us a sense of the situation. Her brother faces in prison. She'll probably provide her insights into the political dissatisfaction that's so widespread in Venezuela at the moment. Also joining us is Jared Gensler, the international lawyer representing Leopoldo Lopez, who will participate in today's discussion as well, and I thank you for being with us today. Before we start, I want to remind you all that we're on the record this afternoon and that we're webcasting this event live to our online audience. Other media outlets have joined us as well. After Adriana speaks, and I think we'll get Jared involved as well, we'll have a Q&A. And this is a topic that's near and dear to a lot of folks here. So when you do have an opportunity to ask a question, try to be as brief as you can so we can get as many as we can. With that in mind, I'm going to pass it over to you, Adriana, and we'll start from there. So thank you.
Thank you, Carl.
Sure.
And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Leopoldo's youngest sister, by 6 years, but we are actually very close. We're very similar in different ways, and I think of Leopoldo as a mentor, and I really admire him. One thing I tell people right off the bat is that everything that Leopoldo has done and did particularly last year and how events unfolded is absolutely coherent with the way that Leopoldo is. Leopoldo is a man of very deep convictions, and he's a man that is very clear in his positions. He does not define himself in the gray areas. And actions like what he did last February 18th demonstrate that he fights for what he believes and he doesn't waver. And I think that if anything has happened this year is just reaffirm to us as a family and to himself that that's the person that he is and that's the right person to be. I saw him recently 3 weeks ago, actually 3 days before he had his last requisa, when they came into his cell and took him away and put him in solitary confinement. And I had not seen him since he had been in jail.
And a lot of folks that cover Venezuela are very familiar with the story. But there's a lot of people that don't know very much about him, don't know why he's in jail. And there's a lot of folks who also wonder, what does the government fear about Leopoldo? I mean, why is he such a threat?
Well, I'll answer the last question first. I think the government fears a person that has no fear. Leopoldo is absolutely fearless. And if anybody doubts that, then they haven't been paying attention. And I think it comes back to what I said. He has a very deep conviction of what is right. And by having such clarity, he is not afraid to confront the government and call out what's wrong. So why is he in prison? Is because he was, in his discourse and his actions, calling the government out on the things that are bad with the system. From an economic and a social standpoint, and the details are known to everybody, he was supporting student protests on February 12th, and he was calling for nonviolent, peaceful protests. And when it was over, he told people to peacefully leave the stage, so to speak. And then, they set him up, and they're trying him for inciting violence through his discourse. That's what supposedly he's being tried for.
And things have gotten pretty rough in Venezuela, and things are pretty violent. Do you think that Leopoldo faces bigger risks when he's out of jail? I mean, how do you see
it's
that?
interesting to if we go back to the week when Leopoldo was in hiding. Leopoldo, this is an interesting detail. So the protest that I was talking about on February 12th, he leaves the place of the protest at around 2 in the afternoon. The deaths happened between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. And at 9 p.m., the government had issued a warrant for his arrest, blaming him for these deaths. There was definitely not enough time to pull all the evidence that would point to Leopoldo as the actor, intellectual material. And the first thing he said, Adri, I'm doing well. I've been preparing myself for this for a long time. And what he meant by that is that he has been persecuted by the Chavez government earlier and now by Maduro's. So he's had the chance to think that this was a possibility, and he has internalized what that meant. And with that, he has used the time to really focus on spiritual growth, intellectual growth, and working on what he sees as his political, economic, social plan for the future. He is a public servant. That's the one thing that defines him. A lot of people have asked, why didn't he leave the country, go in exile, or remain in hiding? I don't think, I think of that scenario and I see a very saddened individual, somebody that would be trapped by the wrong decision. So when I saw Leopoldo, I saw the person that I know. His eyes were bright, his smile was big, his big charismatic smile that people recognize him by. And he knew that he was doing the right thing. He said it's been very hard. The hardest thing has been to be separate from his children. He has little children, 5 and 2. They were 4 and 1 when he went to jail. So that's like any human being. That's just that, the human piece is hard. I had a child. He wasn't there for that birth. My sister got married. He was not there. My father turned 70 years old. He wasn't there. So he's missing. We miss him. But we support him. We are with him, and he's alive. We are all, as a family, working on his behalf. Everybody has been doing different things, but we have really taken it at heart to make sure that people know who Leopoldo is, because by knowing who Leopoldo is, you know about Venezuela. And another important thing about Leopoldo's action is that Leopoldo is a symbolic prisoner. Leopoldo was speaking on behalf of millions of people in Venezuela that don't have a voice. Leopoldo has the privilege of having a platform that people listen to. And by caring about Leopoldo, you care about other political prisoners. And that's really one of the missions that we have as a family, is to ensure that that voice is heard.
You've talked a lot about sort of the personal dimension, right? It's your brother, right? I mean, people talk about the political side, and obviously there's a huge context here, and what people are suffering and people are fighting in Venezuela are very, sensitive, passionate things. Can you talk a little bit about your brother's condition? How have they treated him? You talked about his psychological condition a little bit. How is his health in general?
I saw Leopoldo well. He's very thin, but he's very strong. Now, fortunately, he has not been tortured like other people in Venezuela have, that we don't know who or how or what has happened. We know that people are being tortured. Leopoldo's been tortured in a different way. He is getting a lot of psychological torture, so to speak, when they punish him without reasons. His children show up to see him, and they say, you can't come in, he's punished. Why? Well, he's just punished. So, 2 weeks go by, and he can't see his family. The first 6 months of his imprisonment, he was not able to leave his cell. They took him out in the mornings at 6 in the morning for 1 hour, and that's all the daylight he got. And he had no interactions with any of the inmates or any other people other than his direct family. They have done things, you might have read about this, where they punished him by throwing excrement and urine into his cell and cutting the water and electricity so that he couldn't clean up. So those are the type of tortures that they do to him. When I went to visit him, I was not allowed to see him 3 times. He was just in the last bit that I was able to see him. Just little things that they do because they knew that he really wanted to see me. So that was upsetting. But they have really punished him a lot. Right now he's in solitary confinement again in a 2x2 cell. And it is detrimental to his health because he cannot see the daylight for days in a row.